Hi, Lighthouse. Thanks for joining us this morning as we continue our series on politics. This will be our last topic for the series as we cover why economic policy matters to the Christian. Then we have Election Day on Tuesday, and the next Sunday, Dom will wrap us up with some reflections on the election results as well as for the series as a whole. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Yang and I'm the youth deacon here at ACC. I taught last month on why caring for the immigrant and refugee should matter for the Christian, and as I mentioned then, I'm really glad we're going through this series on politics. With the election coming up in a couple of days, this is one of the most relevant and timely ways that we can discuss how our faith practically plays out in our day-to-day lives. Also, it seems like everywhere we turn, there's conversation about the election. Personally, I've gotten more spam calls, texts, and ads telling me to vote for or against a particular candidate than I've ever gotten before. Whether politics is something that you're actively interested in or not, it's a very tangible part of our lives right now and our culture. And as such, it's important to understand how our faith should frame and should impact our view on politics. Also, since most of us identify as Asian Americans, we belong to one of the most sizable but least politically active groups by race in the US, which is to say, politics isn't something we're really used to talking about. But like Don mentioned before, our goal for this series isn't to necessarily convince you of any particular policy, but to start the conversation about how our faith, our Asian American identity, and our politics all intersect. When it comes to our faith, the Bible doesn't prescribe any specific directions to follow in terms of policy, but it does give us some general principles that should serve as guidelines. We covered these the first few weeks of this series, but as a reminder, they're first, the command that as Christians, our primary goal should be to love God and to love our neighbors. Second, the idea that character matters when it comes to our politicians, since we're rarely going to find a candidate that we agree with 100% in terms of policy. And third, that all humans are intrinsically worthy of love and respect, since we're all made in the image of God. These principles will all come into play as we talk about economic policy in today's lesson. Economics is arguably the broadest topic that we have in this series, and it can be argued that economic policy is one of the main underlying factors in almost every topic that we've discussed so far. Politics is largely about managing different trade-offs, since both time and money are limited resources. A very, very oversimplified version goes something like this. You can pay for immigration services, or you can pay for healthcare. Or you can pay for gun control, or you can pay for environmental regulations. Now, of course, we'd rather do all of the above, and we should care about all of those topics individually. But when making policy decisions, we typically need to set priorities by determining which issues get the most focus and consequently the most funding. And these are typically economic trade-offs, and these decisions can get really complicated really quickly. For example, let's say you have two activities that you really enjoy doing. Activity A costs you $20 each time you do it, activity B costs you $5 each time. Now let's pretend activity A brings you 10 happiness points and activity B brings you 15 happiness points. Which one do you do? It's pretty simple, right? Activity B costs less and also makes you more happy. Obviously, you pick that one. However, now let's introduce a third option. Activity C costs you $50 each time, but brings you 100 happiness points. Now what's the best option? Value-wise, it's still activity B. But what if you're not only searching for value? What if you just want or just need a lot of happiness really quickly? Now we just introduce another type of cost. This one in the form of time or energy that you have to invest and not just dollars you have to pay. What if activity B takes 30 minutes of your time, but activity C only takes 10 minutes? Then we also have to consider other factors, like how you're feeling in the moment. For example, if you're really sad, you might not care how much activity C costs. You might just want a boost in your mood, so you're willing to pay more than usual. We also have to take into account that we have limited money. Maybe you really want to do activity C, but you don't have $50 to spend, so it's not feasible. Or maybe you do have the money, but because the value is so much lower, you determine that it's just not worth it. Next thing to consider is, what if the benefit or the reward isn't immediate? What if an activity gives you good value, but you have to wait longer for the reward? Maybe it's worth it, or maybe not. It gets even more complicated when we factor in whether the reward that we've been discussing is even something you directly benefit from or not. Is the activity still worth doing if it only helps someone else? If that someone else was a close friend or a family member, then sure, maybe. But what if that was a stranger? Maybe if the cost was low and you knew how your actions were helping, then you'd still do it. But what if the cost was high? Now, of course, this is an extremely simplified and pretty silly scenario, but hopefully it shows how economic policy and decisions get complicated really quickly, even if it's just hypothetical. When it comes to economic policy, these are the types of decisions our government has to make, but obviously at a much larger level, with much more complicated issues, and for much higher stakes. Because it's so complicated, let's first anchor ourselves in what the primary role of government is when it comes to economic policy. Whenever there are a lot of different options and a lot of trade-offs to be made, it's helpful to have an ultimate purpose to be able to point back to. So when it comes to economic policy, the primary role of government is to promote the economic development of the nation as a whole and consequently its citizens. Now, when we hear that, it's easy to think that that's an overly materialistic way to view the world. And I would agree if we were saying that the primary goal of a Christian is to promote his or her own economic development, but that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is that the government should promote the welfare of the nation as a whole. Also, there are plenty of biblical examples where economic development of the land is depicted as something for God's people to strive for. For example, in Genesis 41, Joseph oversaw 7 years of unprecedented prosperity in Egypt. Wise stewardship of the crops during that time is what enabled Egypt to survive the following 7 years of famine and gain more influence and power throughout the region. In Jeremiah 29, the prophet warns the exiles to settle into Babylon and seek the prosperity of the land. Jeremiah told them that they should get comfortable and that they prosper as the land prospers. When it comes to government and the economy, the government is supposed to promote the general welfare of its people, and there are 5 main ways the government does this. 1, by protecting private property and business. 2, maintaining a stable currency. 3, ensuring safety through quality regulations when needed. 4, establishing an unbiased justice system. And 5, providing for at least the minimum needs of the most vulnerable population. How does the government do these things, though? And where does the government get the money and the resources to do them? Well, the primary means is through taxes. Whether or not taxes should exist isn't really a debate most people have. However, there are a lot of different tax systems with various pros and cons. A few examples are a fixed amount flat head tax, a flat percentage of income, or a progressive tax that increases along with your income. There's also a question of who gets taxed more: individuals with higher incomes, corporations that operate within the country, or people who buy imported goods. We won't really get into different tax systems in this lesson since it gets pretty messy and there are a lot of complicated tax codes and loopholes. But know that there are generally 2 camps: those who want to increase taxes and therefore increase the spending on the things they're used for, and those who want to decrease taxes and therefore let people keep more of their income to spend how they wish. The next conversation revolves around what the government does with the taxes it collects. There are basic things that benefit society as a whole, things like infrastructure, such as roads and highways, or defense, such as paying the military or deploying satellites used for communication. And people generally agree that these things are important, but there's debate on how much should be spent on each. Other things like caring for the poor can be a bit more controversial. Now, the concept of caring for the poor shouldn't be controversial for the Christian. There are plenty of examples in the Bible where we're commanded to do this. Specifically in Galatians, after meeting with the other apostles in Jerusalem and confirming his understanding of the gospel, the apostles asked Paul to remember the poor when establishing the church among the Gentiles. Similarly, when giving the law in Deuteronomy, Israel was commanded to take care of their neighbor who fell on hard times. This should be a principle that all Christians can agree on. The controversy comes in when discussing whether or not caring for the poor should primarily be done by the government, by the church, or by private companies. There's also debate on who does what and what exactly should be done. Also, when it comes to economic policy, there's discussion on where caring for the poor should fall within the government's priorities. This will be our main focus for the rest of the lesson. As we mentioned earlier, the Bible doesn't condemn seeking economic prosperity of the country. In 1 Timothy 6:6-19, Paul takes this to an individual level as well when talking about contentment. I skipped through a lot here, but Paul mentions that Godliness with contentment is great gain, but those who desire to be rich fall into temptation. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. Having wealth isn't condemned in the Bible. However, pursuing riches or trusting in those riches to save us is. Having wealth was meant to enable the Christian to be more generous, so we could provide for our family and friends, we could enable more local and global missions through our giving, and so we could better contribute resources to caring for the poor. The flip side to this, though, is because of sin in the world, humans can be greedy. This can lead to unethical practices in order to maximize profits, avoiding paying our fair share of taxes, or exploiting those who are desperate for work because you know you can pay them less. At the same time, humans are called to work. We were created for work, and work was always meant to be part of our worship. This is evident in Genesis, where God gives Adam a task before sin enters the world. However, sin corrupted our work as well, and made it difficult and tedious. If we're able to, though, we're supposed to work to support ourselves, our families, and our community. I would even go so far as to say that it's sinful if we are able to work and we choose not to. With that in mind, there are definitely those in our communities who are not able to work and need help from the government or from the community. Similar to before, not being able to work or needing some help is not a bad thing in and of itself. However, because of sin, some people may seek to maximize the amount of assistance they're getting, even if they don't really need it. In both cases, whether it's greed or it's fraud, the government has a responsibility to ensure that everyone pays their fair share and that those who truly need the help are getting it. But what does it actually mean, though, to care for the poor? In my mind, it means that a combination of the community, including the church, and the government provide for the minimum needs of the most vulnerable in society. This includes food, clothing, shelter, and an education that can enable that person to secure meaningful employment to sustain themselves. I think this can start with the government, but then it's up to the church and the community to do the rest. There's also a lot of debate on what the best way is to meet those needs. Again, we typically have a trade-off here. This time it's between immediate and temporary results versus long-term but more gradual results. Ultimately, both are needed as neither would be completely effective by themselves. Immediate results are things you hear about ACC doing all the time. Canned food drives, donations to the Adobe Resource Center, helping provide school supplies. These are typically needs that are immediately relevant and can be addressed by material donations. However, they'll continually arise since there will always be a need. Long-term results are harder to see and measure. They're things that build the community up as a whole, like last week's Hope Fest, or mentoring at Graham, or just investing more in education as a whole. These may not pay off immediately, but they serve to help raise the community up as a whole rather than addressing one particular need. Again, we need both solutions since neither are completely effective by themselves. The issue often arises, though, because people naturally want to see results. We're good at helping when we know how our money and our efforts are contributing to those who need it. It's really obvious how donating canned food to a food pantry helps people who are struggling to feed themselves. It's much less obvious how mentoring a student at Graham Elementary can ultimately help elevate a community in need. We typically want to see results, and we want to know that our efforts aren't being wasted, which is again completely normal. But if we're not careful, we end up directing the majority of our efforts towards short-term results and neglecting some long-term efforts. Short-term solutions are meant to kickstart a process, like if someone needed money for rent or food for the weekend, while long-term efforts are meant to help them become self-sustaining, like an education or job placement programs. When it comes to economic policy, there aren't really any easy answers. One thing is clear, though. The Bible teaches us that we need to care for the poor and the vulnerable among us. And a big part of economic policy is how much of our taxes are dedicated to things like welfare, social security, and education. Like previous lessons in our series, we're not trying to convince you about any specific recommendations, but we hope you can consider the nuance in how to prioritize various economic programs and how our call as Christians to care for the poor and the vulnerable among us affects a large part of our country's economic policy. Here are some questions for you to consider in your small groups. We hope it's a challenging and thought-provoking time of discussion. And as always, please stay tuned for some of this week's announcements.
Our only announcement today is that from December 31st through January 3rd, we won't be having youth retreat, so make sure you inform your parents that it's canceled and find something else to do.